Good afternoon and welcome to a very special interview show of The Prode. It has been a year since the United States withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, and the situation in Afghanistan is not at all stable yet. Many experts and analysts even argue that Afghanistan is on the brink of a civil war and is going through its worst ever humanitarian crisis. Joining me today from Melbourne to talk about the human rights situation in Afghanistan is the co-founder and director at the Humanitarian Advisory Group, Beth Eggleston. Thank you so much, Beth, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So I would like to begin the discussion by asking that, first of all, how do you see and analyze the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, and how is the situation there after the 1 year of the withdrawal?
What a year it's been for Afghanistan. I think many of us who have been lucky enough to work in Afghanistan and still are close to Afghan friends and colleagues, our hearts broke last year when the fall of Kabul was announced. We watched on television as we saw the troops withdraw. And I mean, it was something that had been talked about on a political level for quite some time. However, the way in which it was executed and the shocking kind of mess really that has been left and has only really deteriorated over the next 12 months, it's really been quite shocking. And that is on a legal point of view, a political point of view, but I guess for myself, very much mostly on a humanitarian point of view. And I will say that, as I mentioned, I was so lucky to work in Afghanistan. I don't speak on behalf of any Afghans, but I remain connected to friends and colleagues. And from what they tell me, the situation is still extremely dire.
Yeah, how does Sharia law influence the life of Afghanis? Does it have a negative impact on the Afghan people if we see with this from the perspective of Taliban?
It's been really interesting. I've been charting how the international community is seeking to support the Afghan communities going forward. And of course, that international intervention looks quite different now, 1 year on. But really, when you look at the kind of the plans and the assessments that have been done, I mean, it's still, when you look at the population of Afghanistan, and still 24 plus million people are really in need of humanitarian assistance. And that's, really looking at the most dire circumstances. The vast majority of Afghans are really food insecure. And what we're seeing is very unfortunate timing as well for not only just the drought, the economic situation, the impact of the sanctions on people in Afghanistan, but also world events. We're seeing obviously a massive focus now shifting across to what's happening in Ukraine. And that is going to have knock-on effects in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, how the situation of Afghan women how is the situation of Afghan women as of now, and what challenges are associated with the women's education in Afghanistan, and how do you see the women's rights situation after 1 year of the withdrawal of the US troops?
Yes, so the situation and the plight of women and girls in Afghanistan have really been a key focus, I suppose, of not just the aid community, but also human rights organizations and, political regimes outside of Afghanistan as well. So we've seen that although some women have been able to return to university, albeit in a segregated situation, we are seeing in particular teenage girls still not being able to go to school. And it was heartbreaking seeing that expectation that young girls had that they would be going back to school. And when that didn't happen, it was heartbreaking to see the disappointment of them and also their families, including their fathers. So seeing just how much education is valued in Afghanistan. And of course, there are many different initiatives that are, from Afghanistan, Afghan women and others that are trying to still ensure that there are a generation of girls who are going to have access to education. It's also tricky as well. We're seeing some really interesting initiatives for scholarships for women to leave Afghanistan to study. And although there could be a lot of merit in those, how do we get the balance right? Because obviously, if all of the best and brightest women in Afghanistan are able to leave the country, that also can provide challenges on the ground. So it's trying to get that balance right. And we are not seeing really improvements from the attitude or policy shift from the Taliban as far as I can see. We were told when the Taliban took over that they were different, they had moderated their views, that they would allow girls to go to school, and we have not seen that. And perhaps it was naive of the international community to even have considered that that may even occur. So it's still very, very disappointing, but we're not seeing any shifts in the near future.
Yeah, I want to share something that, few time ago, like a year ago, former Afghan minister Nargis Nayan came to our show, and she said that the only right that Afghan woman is having these days is the right to breathe. So that's so disappointing to, learn that. So, how do you see the women's education in particular? We have seen that Taliban has segregated the classes, that, okay, women will not sit with the men, or girls will not sit with boys, and things like that. So how do you see and analyze all those things?
I think it's really important. I think it was wonderful that you had Nagas on, and I think we need to do more of that, of listening to Afghan women, because I think it's easy from us to look from the outside and say, well, this is absolutely catastrophic. This must be addressed in some way. The answers, though, lie in Afghanistan itself, and we need to, as an international community, get better to listening to how we can better support Afghan women and the initiatives and the ideas that they have. We need to support and ensure that also that we do no harm in doing that. And I feel like that support needs to be at many different levels. So we focus very much on girls' education and young girls going to school, and we must do that. We also must focus on addressing other human rights abuses, such as child marriage, all the way through to still advocating for women to be in high office and having some kind of higher political and decision-making power in the country. I mean, we see globally, it's very well known that when you try to negotiate peace agreements, if women are not involved, they are much more likely to fail. And of course, there was a very tokenistic and a very tiny effort really for women to be involved in any of the negotiations that were undertaken before the Taliban came into power. And we're not really seeing very much after that as well. There may be, areas in which we need to provide support as an international community that we're not currently doing now. And somehow we need to navigate that whilst not putting Afghan women and girls at risk, which at times, we've seen this all too often. So we need to be nuanced in the way that we're working. We need to listen more, and we need to tailor our support to what's really needed.
Yeah, now coming to the human rights situation in general, like if you talk about men as well, so we know that anybody who is against Taliban or against their ideas is their enemy. So how do you see the overall human rights situation in Afghanistan? Because we know that many men are also being persecuted by their ideology and their misdeeds, whatever we can call it. So how do you see this?
You are absolutely right, and I feel like we do focus a lot on the issue around women's rights, and so we should, but we must not forget the fact that it's all Afghans who are really facing almost an impossible situation at the moment. So I agree with you. I've been also talking with men in Afghanistan and those who have fled Afghanistan, and the pictures that are sent, the kind of the executions that we're seeing, the beatings that we're seeing, not having freedom of movement, people being confined to their homes or scared to leave their homes, people who are being persecuted for the roles that they had either with the former government or with the international community or international military. We're seeing that really in an ongoing basis. And also the freedom of movement, it's very difficult now for Afghans to leave the country. I wouldn't say it was ever easy, but it's harder now than ever. And you have that compounded around now with even more of a failing health system with the pandemic. I've spoken to people who have been, incredibly sick and then don't have access to essential medications. And of course, there's a health system that's in crisis. Community health clinics around the country that need to be providing vital support are not able to work. And I guess that brings us to some of these really tricky questions around, if the international community say they want to support Afghanistan, what about this question of, freezing Afghan assets? What does that mean? And how do we actually support Afghanistan under such a tight sanctions regime? And I guess I speak from a humanitarian point of view, really trying to adhere to those principles of humanity and neutrality, impartiality, independence. And we must not let the political agendas get in the way of being able to support and reach all of those who have the right to receive humanitarian assistance and protection. And there are ways in which we can navigate this complex sanctions regime. We do see humanitarian carve-outs. We are seeing these from other government donors who are able to move money and assets into the country. I'm not saying it's easy by any means. I suppose I was slightly heartened when seeing last month this tragic, catastrophic earthquake that happened in Afghanistan. At least the Taliban actually did ask for international assistance. Again, I'm not saying that that meant that the response was perfect. We are seeing many humanitarian agencies still being able to give assistance in that particular area. And yes, the response has not met all the expectations. But at least the Taliban had recognized that they do need international support. And I don't know how long it will take for, there to be more dialogue between those external, international governments and the Taliban, but there is a recognition that there will need to be, conversations and dialogue.
Yeah, so are you an advocate of the fact that the Western world, as well as the major economies that surround Afghanistan, like India and China, all of these countries should, openly advocate for Afghanistan and openly, support the government back there?
Such a tricky question. I guess I feel it's pretty amazing to me still to see that no country has provided diplomatic recognition of the Taliban regime. Of course, that doesn't mean that they are not having dialogue and having a relationship. We saw that very early on with the likes of China. I do feel like that diplomatic recognition is something that will need to be earned by the Taliban regime. And I think that that needs to be earned through a clear track record to accept there needs to be a shift on human rights and humanitarian access. And we've not seen this absolutely at all. I do think that countries should be conditional on their recognition. They must see substantial changes. And we're almost seeing a deterioration rather than a progression of some of these rights. We are seeing very much, particularly on the food security side of things are deteriorating further. And we're not seeing strong leadership from the Taliban regime. We are not seeing changes in inclusion or any of those kind of rights that mean that civil society can flourish. And that is a key aspect of how you're going to see the strengthening of the country as a whole. So no, I don't see many countries changing their mind anytime soon.
Yeah, with the change of the with the rise of many terrorist groups back there in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, like terrorist groups like, we know that there are many terrorist groups associated with Taliban which are not maybe directly linked with Taliban, but they are working under their umbrella as well. So how do you see that? Are you confident that with the existence of those terrorist groups, countries like India and Pakistan will be able to, would want to have a conversation with Taliban government? Because we know that Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan (TTP) is comes under the umbrella of Taliban only, Afghan Taliban only. So do you think that India and Pakistan, should support Taliban in this case, because there are terror groups running from Afghanistan, which are, which are a national security threat to countries like India and Pakistan?
Absolutely. The geopolitics are so complex here. And I think some of the issues that we raised a little bit earlier around girls' education, there does show that there is just such a fracture within the Taliban, I think, and especially from the highest level down to the ground. We're seeing very different approaches and attitudes to how the country should be run. And I think that is reflected to the fact that there's not such a cohesive group. And I think the more we learn about groups like the Taliban, but actually all the different groups in Afghanistan, the more we realize that we don't know. And I guess something that we have learned is, and we've been shown yet again in Afghanistan, that when one group claims power, there's always another to play the role of the spoiler. As soon as there is one group that is going to take the reins and move in one direction, you are seeing a counterweight come in. And we're seeing there's shocking attacks on in particular the Sikh community recently in Afghanistan has been just so catastrophic to see that groups who are, and a minority of any kind, be that ethnic or religious, are really suffering in a major way. And, we've seen many campaigns, especially with the Hazara ethnic groups, talking about the kind of situation that they are in, and really feeling like they are not being supported and the country is not coming together at all under this regime.
Yeah, now I would like to conclude the discussion by asking that where do you see the future of Afghanistan, and what does the future holds for this whole crisis? Do you think that the Afghanistan crisis is going to be solved in the coming years, or it's going to be more complicated? And how do you see this going, and how do you compare it with the geopolitical situation in Ukraine?
Yes, I feel we have to be, we must be hopeful because we have to be. There is no choice. We cannot say to the 40 million people in Afghanistan that there is no hope for Afghanistan. It's simply, that's just not acceptable. We have to take some responsibility as the international community. We need to learn to listen better. We need to ensure that we are understanding what are the real needs of Afghans and what are the ideas they have to go forward, because they have the ideas there. Rather than international community always coming in with particular processes or structures or initiatives, we need to support the ones coming from Afghanistan. And that's not just by providing money and assistance this way. It must be a way of having meaningful decision-making, meaningful dialogue, and elevating the leadership of those who understand and uphold human rights. I think we need to try and understand, have a clearer picture of what's really going on. I feel that there is a lot of disinformation coming out of Afghanistan or about Afghanistan. Right after the fall of the Taliban, I saw many different images that had been enhanced and changed to shift the narrative there. It was very difficult to understand what was actually going on. And that's still the case. I still, when I read Twitter and I follow a lot of different Afghan journalists and other international people, who are working in Afghanistan, and you get such conflicting views about what's happening. And obviously the huge difference between what's happening in Kabul and what's happening in the rural areas is something that we can't deny. So I'd like to think that that there will be more of a focus on Afghanistan. As I mentioned, there has been such a huge shift away because of what's happening in Ukraine. But I feel like that the Taliban will feel the pressure of the international community. And regardless of what happens with the regime, and regardless of whether or not they are recognized, we have a humanitarian responsibility, and the Afghan people have a right to receive humanitarian assistance and protection. And it's up to us to ensure that they receive that.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your views and really hope that, the situation in Afghanistan gets better soon. On this note, I want to end this interview. Once again, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.